Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 9. In Chapter 9, we are going to introduce the concept of corrections. And I like to start off this chapter with calling it, or posing the question, why do we call it corrections if we are not focused on correcting behavior? Unfortunately, our correctional system is largely a system of warehousing. It's a place where, and corrections, I want you to also know right out the door, doesn't mean just prison. Corrections can be probation, it can be parole, it can be house arrest, it can be community service. There's a myriad of ways that we correct behavior when somebody has violated the law. But the vast majority of those methods of corrections do not really change behavior. So therefore, should we be calling it corrections is the age-old debate. So in this chapter, we're going to sort of introduce the history of corrections. Here at Hack, we have a whole class on corrections. This is just going to give you a little taste. So let's start with, before we had formal laws, before we had a settled, civilized society, what did we do? How did we handle, when people did things wrong to other people? Largely problems and disputes in the early days of our history in colonial America and for a while after that, things were settled by retaliation. Issues were handled via blood feuds, where the family of the victim would take revenge on the family of the perpetrator. I think the problem here is pretty obvious, is that then the family of the perpetrator feels victimized and they feel the need to take revenge on the other family, and it just goes back and forth and back and forth. The old Hatfield and the McCoys, right, where it becomes this generational thing where, nobody can even remember what the original harm was. You just have two families that hate each other that are constantly warring. That was certainly not an organized or a functional method of handling social wrongs against society. It was vigilante law. Earlier codes, a lot of early legal systems and legal codes were based off of Hammurabi, which is, many, many, many hundreds of years ago in history, and it was Hammurabi's code. And in Hammurabi's code, he stipulated eye for an eye, that whoever does harm to you, you get to do the same harm to them. There are some countries that still absolutely use Hammurabi's code, right? Or try to do a version of it. In Iran, in Syria, if you were caught stealing, they will cut your hand off, right? That's kind of a Hammurabi's code driven punishment. There was also a wide use of what we call penal servitude, which meant essentially if you broke the law or you caused harm, you were thrown into slavery. You became a slave, and you had to work for free for an extensive period of time for somebody else in very, very poor conditions. So as we went through history, we realized all of these early approaches just not working, right? They're frequently really inhumane. In many cases, the punishment is notably worse than the offense. And being that we are a civilized society and we are, we attempt humanity and to be humane, we have been evolving ever since, and we still are. Corrections is always in a state of evolution, right? So where have we come? That's where we've come from. Where are we now? Okay, so first thing I want to make a distinction about is the difference between jails and prisons, because most people tend to use those terms interchangeably. However, they are very different. So a jail is a place where somebody who has a less serious offense is held. You can only go to jail and be there for offenses where your punishment is less than 1 year. Anything over 1 year, you are going to go to prison. And prison is where we put our more serious offenders with longer terms. Anything from 5, 10, 20 life sentence years all the way to execution is where people go. They go to prison. We don't do that in jail. So I want you to know that terminology and understand the distinction. The whole purpose behind using jail or prison is incapacitation, right? Incapacitation is literally taking people and removing them from society and limiting their ability to cause damage and to offend. Okay. Incapacitation is one justice aim. There are several justice aims, which we will get to later on in chapter 11. But that is largely what our correctional system does in terms of the penal system, in terms of people who go to jail and or prison. It is a method of incapacitation and warehousing. When we started to get a little bit more civilized and society began to develop a little bit more, we got away from penal servitude and we got away from all of that, and we started getting formal organized jails. And we started with, right here in Pennsylvania, this is something we are famous for, is the Pennsylvania system. And the Pennsylvania system required solitary confinement without labor. Basically, if you broke the law, everybody was put into solitary. There was no labor. You could not speak to one another. You were not allowed to look at one another. You were in isolation for the entirety of your term, and your term could be many, many, many years. So what happened? What was wrong with that? Well, what we found is that the vast majority of people who were incarcerated under the Pennsylvania model lost their minds, quite literally. Human beings are social creatures. We need engagement with one another. And when you put somebody in solitary confinement without any social engagement, any cognitive stimulation, any social exchange, you're going to find that people cognitively decline very, very quickly. And there's, in many cases, no bringing them back. The damage becomes permanent. And so these people who were getting incarcerated for these crimes were coming out in just a terrible state. And what the state was doing in the Pennsylvania system was far worse than the crimes that they had committed. So we got away from the Pennsylvania system because obviously it wasn't doing anybody any good. All right. We went to a couple of things, right? We went to the Eastern Penitentiary model, which was the square, there's a square and then there's like spokes coming out of the square that were cell blocks that were arranged around a central hub. There was still solitary, there was still silence, but now you could have labor outside of your cells. So at least there was something to do. There was some level of stimulation. But we found that people in the Eastern Penitentiary model didn't fare much better than people under the traditional Pennsylvania system. So we started to vacate that approach as well. Early problems in prison, just in general, was there was no gender segregation, right? Men and women were thrown in together. There was no segregation on the basis of age. Child offenders were thrown in with adult offenders. All of this led to a circumstance that was rife for abuse, for rape, for violations and torture of the weakest versus the fittest, right? It was just a really bad situation. So frequently filthy conditions and enforced idleness, right? That very age-old phrase is so true that idle hands are the devil's playground, and very few places in the world is that phrase more true than in prison. If you don't allow inmates something to do, they will find something to do, and it is something that most correctional officers and administrators do not want them to do. So it is better to give them something to do, to keep them with a sense of purpose and function, so that they don't decline cognitively and so that they don't literally get into trouble. We then transferred into the Auburn system. These were small cells that were used only for sleeping. The Auburn system tested the efficacy of the Pennsylvania system by selecting 80 of the most hardened convicts and placing them in solitary for 2 years to see, okay, is this a problem? Like the Pennsylvania system, are we totally done with it, or can we still do solitary? And what they found is after 2 years, they were terribly sick, mentally ill and physically ill. And again, we abandoned this system. Couple of things that are sort of antiquated, still in use in some locations, but not many. The lockstep shuffle, which is where prisoners would have to line up in a line. Each prisoner would have a hand on the shoulder of the inmate in front of him. They would have shackles on their feet. And this was so that they were all essentially attached so that if one tried to get away, they would, all fall down together. They couldn't move very quickly. It was a way of managing large groups. Prison stripes. There's still like a very small number of prisons here in the United States that still use them. One, I believe, is, oh God, I want to say Arizona. Their administrator still uses prison stripes. It was born to institutionalize them and easily visually identify them and to stigmatize them. Right. So if somebody were able to escape the prison and they don't have a change of clothes, you're very easily identified as you are an inmate. You shouldn't be out here. Let's call the police. Use of treadmills used to be a form of exercise and punishment, right? They can no longer do that. Solitary confinement is still very much alive and used frequently, but not with the frequency it used to be. It is used as a measure of behavioral control for infraction over the rules, and you're usually only sent there, inmates are only sent there if it's a very serious infraction. Whereas in the previous history of corrections, it was used with much more liberal frequency for things that were very, very small infractions. Something that happened in the past and that still exists today that I want you to be familiar with is the concept of civil death. So what is civil death? Civil death is that when somebody becomes incarcerated and they're removed from free society, um, you lose certain rights, you lose certain freedoms, you lose certain liberties forever, even after you get released from prison into free society. This still happens today. Okay. So back in the early days of our country, you could have lost land. Your wife was considered a widow, even though you weren't dead. Things of that nature, right? We've gotten away from that. You don't lose your land if you own it, right? As long as you don't owe anybody, money or civil. There's no civil forfeiture or anything, and your wife can stay your wife, right? But now you lose. You still have something called. You still have civil death. You lose your right to vote. Right? You lose your voice in the American democracy. You can no longer exercise your thoughts, your stance, your political opinions because you are no longer able to participate in elections. You lose the opportunity to hold many forms of employment. Immediately, if you are a convicted felon, all forms of state and federal employment off the table, right? There are many private sector jobs off the table, right? And even if there are jobs that don't specifically exclude you, there are many jobs that simply will not hire you because you are a convicted felon. You lose your right to subsidized federal loans, which means if you don't have money, you can't go to college, you can't obtain an education, you can't obtain a skill to make yourself marketable and to earn a living, right? So this limits you as well. So we still have what we call civil death today. And it's a very controversial issue, all of these things. That if somebody's paid their debt to society and they've spent time in prison, they've done what they've been punished, they've served out their term, why are we still punishing them when they get out into free society? Shouldn't they have the opportunity to be a functional member of society? And can they be a functional member of society if they can't get an education, if they can't get sustainable legal work, right? Why do we continue the punishment above and beyond the prison sentence? So civil death is a very controversial issue, but it's still very much alive and well today. Okay, we will continue in chapter 11.